So by way of introduction, we're Occupy Mountain View. And I guess in the short time since those sleeping bags were unfurled about 5 months ago to initiate Occupy Wall Street, our political lexicon has changed completely. 99%, 1%, inequality, these are the ideas that are floating around in our culture constantly. So many people feel that the government is no longer responsive and very concerned about the lobbyists, the banks, the financial institutions, and the corporations that influence them. Inequity, which we're going to be talking about tonight, is not only an economic issue, it's really bad for capitalism, but it's also a moral issue, and it's actually a risk to our democracy. So to disabuse you a little bit about what Occupy is and is not, Occupy is not about seizing territory. So we're not going to take over this room tonight. It's actually an educational process to inform people and to direct attention to abuses and hopefully to empower people to make some changes in the long run. And this is not a short-term endeavor. So to understand where we are and where we're going, I think it's very important to know where we've been. And now we're very fortunate to have Paul George here, who's the director of Peninsula Peace and Justice, a long-term organizer, activist, and educator respected throughout the peninsula. And he's here to discuss with us the history of economic and political inequality in America. So let's give George a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yeah.
All right. Happy Leap Day. I tried to look up a joke about Leap Day, and all I could find were Sadie Hawkins jokes, and I don't want to go there, so we'll just skip that. Do you think we can pass some legislation unanimously while we're in? So, move to amend. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once noted, quote, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both," end quote. Brandeis served on the Supreme Court at a time when the country was trying to struggle with great changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Changes that were creating great inequalities in this country. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1916, Brandeis reviewed laws that established the first minimum wage and the first maximum working hours, and efforts to rein in monopolistic utility and insurance companies. These efforts in the early part of the 20th century were mostly unsuccessful. By the time of the Great Depression, economic inequality in this country was at a peak. In 1928, on the eve of the Great Depression, the top 1% of the population, that famous, infamous 1%, they were pocketing 24% of all the income in this country. The 1% taking in 24% of the income. In order to find a period in American history that would match this great inequality in the distribution of wealth in the country, you'd have to look at right now. In 2007, the last year for which statistics are complete, the top 1% of the population accounted for 23.5% of total income in the country. Essentially the same as just on the eve of the Great Depression. And I don't think it's mere coincidence that those two numbers, those two peaks in inequality came before the Great Depression and the Great Recession. The story of the hyper-concentration of wealth in the hands of a few is what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's a fact of economic life in this country, a fact that most people sense is the case, but very few really have any idea just how out of balance the distribution of wealth has become. And it's a fact that impacts on every other aspect of life in this country, every other aspect, and especially in the way it impacts our democracy. Franklin Roosevelt said, "Political equality, the very basis of the American political system, is, quote, meaningless in the face of economic inequality." Franklin Roosevelt. Political equality is meaningless in the face of great economic inequality. This concentration of wealth has not always been the case in this country. In fact, in the modern era, the time after World War II, quite the opposite was true for several generations. The post-war prosperity of the United States was, in general, broadly shared. Not complete equality by any means, no way, but far more equal than what we have today. From the high inequality of 1928, just before the Great Depression, when the top 1% again took home the 24% of the national pie, that figure showed a steady decline up until the war years. And in the first several decades after the war, the percentage of income that flowed to the top 1% continued on a slow, small downward slope. In general, the distribution of income remained pretty much level, with the top 1% accounting for just 10% of the country's income. That figure hit an all-time low in 1976, when the top 1% could claim only 8% of the income pie. But things started to change from that point on, and that's the period that we're going to look at today. Since this talk will, well, you know, often I've given this talk before, variations of this talk, and sometimes I get a little audience participation going, but I'm going to skip that tonight. Usually I get people to stand up in proportion to who owns what part of wealth. But let me just run through these. In 1970, now we're going to talk about wealth instead of income, just total assets in the country. In 1970, 20% of the population held 50% of the income. So 20% had as much income as the other 80%. By 1980, that was down to 15%, had half the wealth in the country. By 1990, it was 12%. By the year 2000, 10% of the population was holding half the wealth. And by 2007, again the last year for complete statistics, only 8% of the population was holding half the wealth of the country. Again, in 1976, the top 1% accounted for 8.9% of all the income in the country. By 2007, that same 1% was now taking home close to the 24% of the national paycheck that we saw before the Great Depression. When I use the term income, I don't just mean paychecks, by the way. Income in this case includes wages, investment income, interest, dividends, capital gains. In fact, the top 5% actually make most of their money through income other than wages, which accounts for only 18% of their income. That alone doesn't tell the whole story, however. Let's run through a couple more statistics. I won't go over too many statistics, but I think it's important to put it in context. So a couple more to just see how far we've come from relatively widespread prosperity to the rampant inequality of today. Average incomes, of course, have generally continued to rise over the years since the 1970s, as the U.S. economy has continued to grow and expand, up until recent years, of course. We're all familiar with the old cliche about how a rising tide lifts all boats. We've heard that time and again. I suspect most of us don't really believe it, but just to make sure, let's take a quick look at how our U.S. economic harbor is doing and how the various boats are faring. Since the late 1970s until a few years ago, the poorest 20%, the lowest 20% of the population, have seen their annual average income increase by about 11% over those years, in those 30, 40 years. The next 20% of the population saw an 18% raise in their income. And the middle 20% saw a 21% rise in their income. It's not exactly equality, but among the bottom 60% of the population, those economic boats are all rising at roughly the same rate. Not great, but not too awful either. It's when we start to look at the upper levels of the income scale that we start to see that there's something not quite right with our harbor. The next 1/5 of the population, those in the 60th to 80th percentiles, saw a 32% rise in their annual incomes from the 1970s until just recently. And when we look at the people who constitute the top 80 to 99% of the income ladder, we see a 55% rise over this same period. The boats of the poor have risen 11%. The boats of the wealthy have risen 55%. But there's still that tiny handful of votes that we haven't accounted for yet. The very top 1%, those famous 1%. This 1% saw their annual average income rise by an astonishing 256% over those same years. 256%. Compared to that figure, the vast majority of votes in this country are not rising. They're either bailing water like mad or just flat out sinking. I thought of making some bar graphs and pie charts to go along with this talk to help illustrate some of these statistics. So, for example, but I had a problem. If I were to make a bar graph to show these different extremes in the rise of average income, if I drew a bar about this long for the poorest and their 11% increase, the bar for the wealthiest 1% would reach from here across the room. And I just couldn't put that in my folder to bring along the chart. Okay, one final statistic, and then we'll get to the history that I promised. In our current economic downturn, in the midst of this incredible inequality, the top 3% of the population now accounts for 40% of all the consumption in this country. Top 3%, 5%, I'm sorry, it's my bad glasses, bad eyes. Top 5% accounts for 40% of all the consumption. Now, since consumption is the #1 driver of our economy, that means that the overall health of our economy rests in the hands of a very tiny community, a minority, of course. No doubt you've all heard of the term plutocracy, from the Greek root for the words wealth and government, or government by the rich. But maybe you haven't heard a new variation on that word. It's called plutonomy, which roughly means governance and an economy of the very wealthy. The word was coined by a Citibank analyst a few years ago, and it was in an analysis meant for its wealthy investors. The report leaked out just long enough for it to be on the web, long enough that some people got a hold of it. It's no longer available anywhere on the web, no matter how you search. I have searched endlessly for it. I have found quotes from it, though, in other articles. In a plutonomy, everything is of, by, and for the rich, and they don't need the rest of us. This is what this study said. They exist completely apart. They don't need the rest of the society. The main conclusion of the Citibank analysis was that the rich and their government and their economy could get along just fine without the bottom 90% of the population. We seem to be firmly into the era of plutonomy. The question before us then, and that's why I'm here tonight, is how did this happen and why did this happen? After decades of generally shared prosperity, why, starting sometime in the 1970s, did all the economic trends reverse themselves, delivering us onto the shores of the drastically unequal economy we have today? The first thing to do in trying to answer that question is to find out what did not cause it. So, a lot of economists and other analysts have given many reasons for this rise in inequality, especially as Occupy has made this part of our national conversation. They point out, and this is correct up to a point, that this has been the era of globalization, of undreamed of advances in technology. We've gone from the space age to the information age. And that's all true, and there's one quick way to test whether these factors have driven the rise in inequality in our country. Did other countries in the industrialized West experience a similar growth in their inequality? And the simple answer is no, they didn't. While inequality has grown somewhat in Europe and Canada, no other country has seen anything anywhere near approaching the hyperconcentration of wealth that we've seen in this country. Nowhere close. The only other country that shows even a hint of having as much increase in inequality is Canada. And Canada's slightly above average increase in inequality didn't happen uniformly. In the French-speaking parts of Canada, the increase in inequality has been very much like the rest of the world, except for the United States, rather moderate. The assumption is that the English-speaking parts of Canada show an increase in inequality because they are in the most direct competition with U.S. corporations and their salary structures and all that. So the rest of the world didn't see this huge increase in equality that we have seen in these past 30, 40 years. So what did happen here in the United States, starting in the 1970s, that led to today's hyper-concentration of wealth? Let's wind the clock back just a little bit before the 70s and look at the late 60s and early 70s. The 1960s was, among other things, the era of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, when many of the programs that Washington is actually battling over today started. There were, of course, the Voting and Housing Rights Acts, the great civil rights achievements of the era, but there was also the beginning of Medicare and Medicaid, an expansion of consumer and environmental protection regulations, and an expansion of the rights and clout of organized labor. Even the late 60s and early 70s, with Richard Nixon in the White House, saw a continuation of the great social progress of the 1960s. Now, Nixon was a true conservative on domestic social issues like crime, guns, and the like. And he cynically engaged in the politics of resentment. Read that as the politics of racism, and a politics that we're seeing repeated again in this atrocious election that we're currently experiencing. And in the arena of foreign policy, of course, he was like all the rest, a bloodthirsty imperialist. But Nixon, like most presidents before him, for several decades actually, was confronted with the reality of a Congress strongly dominated and controlled by the Democratic Party. And he was willing to make compromises with that majority in order to push other parts of his agenda. Now, I came of age during this period. I became an activist in the late 60s around the Vietnam War, and I despise Richard Nixon just about as much as anybody else who shares my political views and had to live through that. But at the same time, I can honestly make an argument that Richard Nixon was the last liberal president this country had. Let's take a look at the record. It's amazing what was going on in this period. Nixon oversaw the most rapid increase in domestic spending since the Great Depression. He signed off on a huge expansion of Social Security. He created the National Food Stamp Program. And remember, this is a Democratic Congress pushing all this, so it's not all his achievement, but under his administration. Under his watch, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by presidential directive, I might add, along with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the National Transportation Safety Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Mine Safety and Health Administration. He instituted wage and price controls to counter increasing inflation. Can you imagine wage and price controls? That's a hell of a lot more socialistic than anything Barack Obama has done to be labeled a socialist. Understandably, this period of advancement for so many ordinary people in our society was met with alarm by certain other segments of our society, namely big business and the corporations. And they resented anything that might regulate, i.e. restrict, their ability to maximize their profits. So they were in turmoil. The rest of us were seeing great social advances. The real turning point that we're looking for when we search for the origins of today's massive inequality, I think, and this is my thesis, came in 1971. Mine and others, this is not original work. I've drawn this from a lot of sources. Future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, who was then a corporate lawyer and served himself on 11 different corporate boards, wrote a memo to a colleague in preparation for a meeting the following day at the Chamber of Commerce. They were going to discuss what to do about all this populist activism in Washington, D.C., they and several other corporate board people. The memo began with these words, quote, "No thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack. What now concerns us is quite new in the history of America. We are not dealing with sporadic or isolated attacks from a relatively few extremists or even from the minority socialist cadre. Rather, the assault on the enterprise system is broadly based and consistently pursued. It is gaining momentum and converts." That's the problem with democracy. You know? It's a mess. Really messes around with the plans of the corporations. He went on in some great length describing what he saw as the problem, and a lot of it was this listing of things that I just gave you. then he proposed his solution, and that's what the meeting was about, was to start to implement this solution. I want to read a couple paragraphs directly from the memo and his solution. August 1971, quote, "Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary it must be used aggressively and with determination, without embarrassment and without reluctance, which has been so characteristic of American business. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations." End quote. Well, that's pretty powerful stuff. If you take out the references to business, this could be the manifesto of a revolutionary party. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Except this was to be a revolution of, by, and for the corporations. A revolution first in the willingness of big business to wield decisive political power, and second, in an accompanying willingness to act together, to organize, to achieve their political ends. Now, businesses had always done lobbying. I mean, that goes back to the founding of the Republic. But it was such that if there was a bill in Congress that affected the railroads, they would be down there lobbying or on the phone to their congresspeople. Or if it was a bill that would affect the insurance companies would send a couple of lobbyists. But never before had they proposed banding together just as large, powerful corporations for a large overall scheme to benefit themselves and to work together and combine their financial resources together. This was something new that Powell was proposing, and it truly was revolutionary, and we're feeling the effects of it today. Powell's memo laid out an entire strategy to manipulate public opinion, influence Congress, even to affect what was being taught in the universities. He was very clear that the effort was long-range, possibly taking decades. And he was right, and up until this point, he was apparently has won that decades-long struggle. Powell's memo led directly to, or heavily influenced, the creation of places like the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Manhattan Institute, and many other, eventually, extremely powerful think tanks that would come to play a major role in opinion making right up until today. We basically take these institutions for granted today. We read quotes from them in almost every New York Times article or Washington Post article. Someone from the American Heritage Foundation, someone from the American Enterprise Institute is quoted in these articles. Back in 1971, none of them existed. They were brought into being by this revolutionary document that Lewis Powell put forth. What also didn't exist in 1971 was massive amounts of corporate dollars flowing into it, flooding our political system. Powell's memo changed that too, in a big way. The overall effect of the Powell memo and the new role that business was about to carve out for itself in the political life of our country was practically the equivalent of shock and awe. Around the time of Powell's memo, only about 100 corporations had public affairs offices in Washington, D.C. Only 100 public affairs offices in Washington. Within 7 years, that number had grown to over 500. In 1971, only 175 corporations had registered lobbyists in Washington. Only 175 corporations. Within 10 years of the Powell memo, that number had swollen to 2,500. And we know what it's like today. I mean, 2,500 is one lobbying outfit these days. During this same period, the number of corporate political action committees, those PACs that we all hear so much about, that dole out the corporate financial largesse to the politicians, quadrupled from less than 300 at that period to 1,200. And it continues to grow and grow. Perhaps the most powerful new organization to emerge from this frenzy of corporate organizing was the Business Roundtable, another one that we hear about often today. The Business Roundtable was open for membership only to top CEOs in the country. It was designed to mobilize those CEOs as a collective force to lobby Washington in advancement of their narrow set of interests. Not long after Powell's game-changing memo, the Business Roundtable counted among its members 113 of the 120 largest corporations in America. They represented, this one organization represented fully 1/2 of the American economy. You want some lobbying clout? There's some lobbying clout for you, half the economy. It was a stunningly rapid mobilization of vast financial and organizational resources, all with one aim: to create a new politics that would favor corporations and their wealthy captains over all other sectors of society. There were a couple of other noteworthy changes in the political sphere that took place right around the same time. Right around the same time as Powell's corporate revolution was taking place. Unions, as they remain so today, were allied with the Democratic Party. And although unions made large financial contributions to Democratic candidates and the Central Party, their real role in elections came from the amazing people power they could provide. Unions were able to mobilize large numbers of people to walk precincts on behalf of hundreds, if not thousands, of local candidates. In an age where this kind of campaigning was the norm, it represented a tremendous advantage for the Democrats. But that kind of person-to-person campaigning was coming to an end during this period, and that constitutes the second noteworthy change that helped to propel us into the age of plutonomy. We take for granted today that electoral campaigns take place to a large extent on television. There are still campaign rallies, yeah, but they are mostly organized for the benefit of the television cameras, not to convince anyone to vote for a particular candidate or to come out and hear the candidate for the first time. The late 60s and early 70s were the era when television became the dominant component of campaigning, especially for national office, but also for offices at all levels. With the new importance of television came the urgent necessity to raise the extra campaign cash to be able to afford to compete in this new arena. The day of cheap volunteer shoe leather campaigning was ending, and the cost of elections would skyrocket. You can see where this is going, right? New corporate cash, skyrocketing cost of campaigns. At the same time, an entirely new campaign industry emerged and became central for any successful politician: public opinion polling and the highly paid consultants that came along with this new field. Taken together, television and opinion polling drastically drove up the cost of running for office. And this happened at exactly the same time that the corporations decided to open their wallets and dive head-on into the electoral process. Within a very short period of time, the electoral resources available to the two major parties flipped 180 degrees. Democrats had always been a bit better funded than Republicans, and the availability of all those union workers to walk precincts combined to account for the fact that Democrats held a virtual permanent majority in the U.S. Congress for nearly 60 years after the end of the New Deal. That was soon ending. When elections got more expensive, the tide turned in favor of Republicans, who were the early recipients of floods of new corporate money. It should come as no surprise to anyone that the Democrats started chasing corporate money as well, quickly and fervently. Chasing corporate money, of course, meant satisfying the demands of the corporations. After all, that's why they were offering the money. The change was a stunning and rapid turnaround in Washington, and the fate of union-backed legislation, along with other liberal championed legislative efforts. From this incredible record of the late 60s and early 70s, things turned around rapidly in Washington as the corporations organized together and mobilized. When Jimmy Carter took office in 1977, liberals were looking forward to an even more active period of achievement than they had seen under Johnson and the surprising record of the Nixon years. Instead, almost the entire liberal agenda died under Carter and the new political dynamic in Washington. Tax reform was defeated. A stronger consumer protection agency was killed. This is still a Democratic-controlled Congress. Same-day voter registration never even made it to the floor of the House. A proposed strengthening of the minimum wage died. And perhaps most stunning of all, a long-promised overhaul of labor laws was successfully filibustered in the Senate, despite the presence of 61 Democrats and the presence of many far more moderate Republicans than we are used to today. The plutonomy was born. I'm going to end the history there and take a look at where we might go, where we are, and where we might go. Pretty stunning turnaround. And it shows in the figures of what has happened to income and inequality from the 70s and matches up with corporate spending in our campaign. We all know that story, but I don't think a lot of us know the history of it. It certainly isn't taught in school. There's plenty more history that could be discussed, of course, but the trajectory for the future was pretty much set in stone by the time by the end of the Carter presidency. Since then, the effect of corporate domination and control of our political system has only deepened and become more institutionalized. It certainly hasn't helped that the Supreme Court has endorsed on several occasions the corporate intrusion into our political processes, ruling that money equals speech and therefore it cannot be restricted. Various feeble efforts at so-called campaign finance reform have been put forth, only to be vetoed by the High Court. The most infamous ruling came, of course, with Citizens United, which went far further than any other Supreme Court ruling in blessing the unlimited influence of corporate money. And boy, are we seeing the outcome of that decision these days. I'll assume you're all familiar with Citizens United case, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the Supreme Court, when they took that case at the urging of Chief Justice John Roberts, first of all, met in an extraordinary session to consider the case. They weren't even in session. He called a special meeting to consider Citizens United. Roberts invited parties to the case to submit briefs about campaign money and corporate free speech issues that went far beyond the parameters of the case as it originally came to the court. The people of Citizens United who brought this case weren't asking for half of what they got out of the Supreme Court. It's clear that Roberts was searching for a case that would allow the court to strongly endorse and enshrine the role of corporations in elections, and he found it in Citizens United. The case may very well have put an end to any hope, ever, of campaign finance reform. If speech is money and money is speech, the Constitution says you cannot regulate it. We wouldn't want speech regulated, would we? One critically important effort, though, I think, to respond to this, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, of course, is move to amend. It's the one effort that strives to take head-on all these various Supreme Court rulings regarding corporations as entities that have rights, including free speech rights, by audaciously proposing to amend the Constitution in order to void the so-called rights of corporations. It's going to be a very difficult goal to achieve, but I think it's an effort well worth supporting and becoming involved in. Various campaign finance reform efforts are now extremely limited in what they can achieve because the Supreme Court, again, has ruled that money equals speech and cannot be limited. Move to amend will try to tear down that protective wall that corporations have built for themselves over the years. Interestingly enough, the very first idea of corporations as entities, as people, came so that corporations could be sued and dragged into court as a corporation. That's where it all started, and it's expanded greatly since then. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to go deeply into that, but just a little aside on that one. The public today has a sense that things are out of balance. They have a sense that corporations wield too much power. And they have a sense that wealth is concentrated in too few hands. Much of that public awareness, of course, has come about because of the Occupy movement, just in the past 6 or 8 months. But most people have no idea just how bad the situation is. Public opinion polls reveal that this is the case. When asked about income inequality in the country, the majority of people respond in the affirmative. People are sitting on too much money and have outsized influence that money buys for them. But when they're asked just how much the concentration of wealth is out of balance, they don't even come close to being able to identify or describe the situation. Those numbers that I started with. people think it's like a tenth of that. You know, ask what the increase in the wealthiest 1%'s income over the last 30 years has been. Instead of the 256%, they kind of say it's a little bit more than mine, so they'll say, you know, 50%. Any public campaign that serves to educate the general public as to just how serious the problem is an important undertaking then. You know, we often hear the phrase, speak truth to power. It's a favorite phrase of the progressive movement. I'm not sure, I've never been sure that that's the right way to think about it, or make that our goal. Because, frankly, power already knows the truth. We need to speak the truth to the people, because power is lying to the people and concealing the truth from them. So let's speak truth to the people. The pushback against the corporate domination of our political and social systems is going to have to take many forms, and we must keep in mind that it will be a long struggle and not be daunted by that fact. It's going to be a long struggle. It's not going to end next year, or even this summer, or in November, for crying out loud. And this is where the Occupy movement comes in. One critical aspect of any campaign to reverse these damaging trends will come through the absolute necessity to publicly demonstrate our opposition to corporate influence in all its variations. We may not be able to afford to match the corporations in spending on TV advertisements, but we can be advertisements ourselves by taking to the streets. Occupy is also a critically important movement in that it represents direct resistance to the transgressions of corporate domination. Never underestimate the power of this kind of resistance. We can take another lesson from history here, and this is another history lesson that they don't teach in schools. During our country's last period of immense inequality, the time just before and during the Great Depression, saw a massive wave of locally organized resistance efforts. These local efforts, numbering in the thousands and occurring all around the country, much like today's Occupy actions, took on many forms and addressed a whole menu of issues and demands. Again, much like today's Occupy movement. Local cooperatives sprung up around the nation, where people traded goods and services, leaving out the corporate middlemen and leaving out the cash. In 1932, there were 330 such self-help organizations in 37 states with nearly 500,000 members. In the coal mining regions of the country during this period, laid-off miners returned to their former places of employment, dug their own mines, mined the coal themselves as wildcatters, and took it to the cities where they sold it for less than the going rate. When the mine owners demanded that the authorities do something about this, juries in these rural towns refused to convict, and jailers refused to incarcerate. In 1934, 5 million tons of coal were mined this way by 20,000 workers. That's taking it into your own hands. New labor unions formed in industry after industry, defining their own established unions, which had become more aligned with the priorities of the corporations and the needs of their own workers. This new wave of grassroots organized labor unions led directly to new labor law legislation that made it easier to organize and protected the rights of workers to organize. There was a massive national movement, again, locally organized, but national in spirit and solidarity, a national movement to resist home foreclosures and evictions. Sound familiar? When word of an impending eviction would spread around the town, hundreds of people would descend on the site of the eviction, and as fast as the police could remove the furniture, the organized townfolk would haul it back in. And this was happening in thousands of places, weekly, around the country. Every week, in towns and cities around the country, literally thousands of demonstrations were taking place as people marched on banks, corporate headquarters, and former employers, demanding justice and jobs. Sometimes these demonstrations erupted into full-blown riots. And this was the era of the first general strikes. Massive action such as the port workers' strike of 1934 that shut down shipping along the entire 2,000 miles of the West Coast. It was not organized by one of the existing unions at the time. It was a wildcat strike organized at the grassroots level. It was this enormous level of citizen-initiated resistance that led directly to the legislation that came to be known as the New Deal. As much as one might admire Franklin Roosevelt, and he was an admirable president, I think, the simple truth of the matter was that he came into office in the midst of open, widespread, and growing insurrection. The country was quite literally on the verge of a revolution, and Roosevelt was smart enough to know it and to respond to it. The New Deal did not come from enlightened leaders in Washington. It came to us from leaders in Washington who were forced into action by agitated, organized, and mobilized population. We made the New Deal. Washington didn't make it. We made it, and our charge today is to make another New Deal. This is why the Occupy movement has gotten so much attention. This is why the Occupy movement has changed the conversation in this country to the point now where the issue of economic and political inequality is topic number one. This in itself is an enormous success, but it's only a start. The corporations of the 1970s themselves hold a key lesson, one that I think we all know, but that sometimes we have to keep reminding ourselves about. Organizing and strategizing and acting together is the key. The history of progressive change in this country is long, and virtually every positive social advancement that has been achieved has come about because of sustained, organized effort by citizens, real people, and these positive ideas that have propelled our society forward. Yes, with steps backward along the way, but all the best ideas have come from the bottom up, from organized people making demands of their representatives, not the other way around. It's our history. Read it, study it, know it, because it's important. Whether it was ending child labor, creating workplace safety rules, the 5-day week, women demanding the vote, civil rights, environmental protection, or any of the other achievements we can point to, the story has always been the same. Organize, organize, organize. The real meaning, the real danger of the growing plutonomy is nothing less than a threat to democracy itself. As I noted at the outset, Franklin Roosevelt realized that political equality is meaningless in the face of massive economic inequality, such as we have today. So in conclusion, let's tear a page from Lewis Powell's infamous memo and change just a few words, just to remind ourselves of what we need to do and the nature of the struggle that confronts us. Here's my memo. Ordinary people must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary it must be used aggressively and with determination, and I would add, nonviolently, without embarrassment and without reluctance, which has been so characteristic of so many Americans. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, and in the political power available only through united action. Let's take Powell's corporate manifesto and make it our own, for we must win this struggle, or the bold American experiment in democracy, flawed as it might be, will once and for all be at an end. That's how serious, I think, how serious the situation we're facing. If we focus our efforts on widespread, organized, and constant pushback against the plutonomy to reclaim our democracy and our country, history teaches us that we can win this difficult struggle in the long run. Thank you very much.
Wow.
46 minutes.
I
I'm sorry,
learned a
Mike,
lot.
I ran over.
I think we all learned a lot.
Good, I hope
But
so.
as you said, it'd be time for questions and comments and opinions. So everybody feel free.
Go ahead.
Very good speech, very pointed, but I wonder if you could take it a step further. What concrete steps do you think could be taken to address the situation?
I think,
Repeat the question, please.
what concrete steps can we take? After complimenting the talk, then there was the but. The best answer I heard This is always, it's a fair question, and always comes up. The best answer I've always heard, I've heard about this came from Michael Parenti years ago. He said, I just gave you the what speech, you want the how speech. That's a whole nother speech. But I really do think the Occupy movement is off to a good start. First, the broad nature of it. The fact that there are Occupies in town after town after town, and new towns being added to the list literally every day. You know, there was an action over in Half Moon Bay today, an Occupy action. They've only been around a few weeks, and Mountain View has been 4 months, is it? And, you know, it continues to grow.
They're in Europe.
Huh?
They're in Europe.
Oh, yes.
This Occupy movement is an Occupy movement. I was just watching the news. The London police
Cleared out
starting to move in on the occupiers in London.
at the St. Paul's Cathedral, I think. Actually, the first Occupy started in Madrid back in March of last year, and they are still there for the same reasons. Israel had millions marching in the streets on economic issues over the summer. Yes, it's global and it's worldwide, but for now, let's talk about revolution here in this country. That's big enough to pull up. So I think all these Occupy actions, the fact that they're so widespread, and yet there's a growing national infrastructure where they are able to communicate with each other. That's powerful. That's kind of a national organization, but widely dispersed, and we know that decision-making is widely dispersed in the Occupy movement. Beyond that, all the various tactics that are coming up, and we haven't seen the most creative ones yet, all of them add to this. Occupy Redwood City, for example, has been trying to do some home foreclosure defenses and going and being with the people being evicted. Other occupies are marching on banks. All of these things have a cumulative effect because they are making it into the media. People are driving by in their own hometowns and they know what it's about. And it reinforces that sense that things are out of balance and that ordinary people are taking it back into their hands. So I know you wanted a 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, do this, do that, but that's not the nature of this, and it's also not the nature of social change. Who could have predicted last summer that there would have been an Occupy movement? The first time I gave this talk was on September 18th of last year, and I had been writing it for a month. I had been invited by the Humanists to speak at their Sunday morning forum. And I wanted to talk about inequality. Well, Occupy Wall Street started the day before. And I'm sitting there Sunday morning rewriting my talk to try to incorporate this whole new movement into this talk. And so we don't know where it's going. But it sure as hell is exciting and really is strategically a good way to go because of its structure, I think, and the broad decision-making structures that are in place, i.e. not top-down. This really is an egalitarian grassroots effort. Yeah?
I heard today of the Occupy stockholders meetings, where more and more stockholders are demanding corporation accountability for their political funding. That is a specific thing that we, if we have investments, can do, because we do have, if you will, shareholder rights to enter those meetings. If it's just one share, and there are many people who have chosen to be politically active by buying one share of Chevron and one share of such and such.
Yeah, the corporate accountability movement for people buying shares and having a voice at the corporate board meetings, or at least the annual meetings, and trying to get shareholder resolutions passed and that sort of thing, has actually been a tactic that's been around for a long time. I know in my Central America Solidarity work back in the 80s, this was a favorite tactic of a lot of people who were targeting corporations that had investments and sweatshop factories in Central America and that sort of thing. And I think it's certainly a good tactic. The problem is that a lot of these shareholder resolutions don't go anywhere. I think along those lines, there's been a new movement to kind of change a little bit for the shareholders to say, when you give $100 million to this PAC, that's not going into our dividend check, and we want to say about it. That may be a very powerful argument when it gets down to it, because the role of the board of directors is to deliver those profits to its shareholders, not $100,000 checks or $1 million checks to corporate, PACs to elect Newt Gingrich. Yeah.
What do you think is the future possibility for a constitutional amendment?
On this corporate personhood thing?
No, on anything we want to do.
On anything, it's a long shot, and it's scary. Listen, it is not easy to amend the U.S. Constitution, and it could be scary if you open up a constitutional convention. Who knows what could be brought forward? But a narrow, focused effort like Move to Amend, where it's going to be pushing one simple amendment to deal with corporate personhood, I think is controllable and may actually be doable. It's actually something that would cross a lot of political boundaries, from Occupy to the Tea Party. I think you would find support for this kind of amendment.
Paul, can I?
But let's make no mistake that it is really, really difficult, and I wouldn't count a whole lot on that happening.
Before the next question, just make a comment. If you're interested in helping us and working on something like this, please leave your email with our sheet outside. And we certainly hope to approach Mountain View and the City Council and to be one of those cities that gets our City Council to endorse Move to Amend.
Yeah, this is one of the first steps. This is what's happening around the country, is getting local city councils to just pass a resolution supporting the concept of this one particular amendment.
It's actually coming to the city council agenda, and maybe the mayor would like to say something. I would like everybody to sign up to support that, if you would like to end corporate personhood, to support the city going in that direction. And Mike, do you have any comments?
Oh, is the mayor here to take back his room? We're not occupying there.
No, I'm here. No, hi, everybody. I'm Mike Kasprzak, and I'm the mayor this year. One of my comrades is here. I am bringing a resolution to the City Council on either March 20th, I hope, or maybe March 27th, a resolution in support of constitutional amendment. So it's the Move to Amend. So,
how can we help you?
well, how you can help is be here. Unfortunately, when we bring those, they're at the end of the agenda, so it'll be later in the evening. It could be as close to 10 or something like that. But showing up, nobody has to really get up and speak. Just everybody has to raise their hand. If one person gets up and say, "Who's here in favor of this resolution?" I don't know who on the council will be supporting this or not. Our city council typically does not get engaged in things beyond the city, but the way you can help is by calling your city council members, sending them emails, and showing up on the night. And I would log on to the city's website to be sure which night it is, but I'll let Josh know definitely what night it is. I think we're going for the 20th of March, but it might be the 27th.
Yeah,
We'll have that definitely on our website when we find out what that date is. So if you're interested in that, sign up outside and go to occupymv.org, and we'll definitely have that information on there.
Warren Buffett has this thing circulating on the internet that claims that in 3 days we could have every American know about this. If we use the internet.
That's true. The internet is a great democratizing tool, but let's remember, not everybody is on it yet, and we can't leave behind the other aspects of democratic action. But again, I'm really glad to hear this. City council resolutions is something that Peninsula Peace and Justice Center has worked on a lot over the years and have been successful. But as Mike pointed out, this is one thing that we hear, that city councils don't want to get involved in things outside the city. Our job as citizens of any city is to remind our elected representatives that these are local issues that do actually affect everybody who live in this town. And so it may seem like it's beyond the boundaries of Mountain View, but it's not. It's about as local as you can get, because everybody in this town is suffering from this inequality. And that's the message to bring, and pack this place on the 20th or the 27th, whenever it is. And thank you again for doing that. It's rare that the mayor, I wish our mayor would bring it. I have to go to the Human Relations Commission and then, yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for coming and give us this speech. Personally, I didn't know, but maybe 1 or less than 1% of what you told us tonight, and I thank you for coming.
Thank you, then I've done my job.
Yes. I don't know if I will be able to express what I want to say. Obviously, as you can tell, English is not my first language, but I will try my best, and I want to be short on that. It is a shame, I think, that the Supreme Court has compared or has equalized the money to speech. In other words, any corporation has the total right to give as many millions as they want to.
Right.
Okay. And that's, in my opinion, immoral, to say the least.
Yeah.
And I think that along those lines, Democrats as well as Republicans have fallen in the trap of the money. Because otherwise, how can you understand or how can you explain the fact that our Democrat president, Barack Obama, comes to San Francisco and anyone can pay up to $30,000 if they can to go and have dinner with him? Then what is he going to say, you know, when he is reelected to those who came and paid $30,000? He has to be on his side.
Right.
And the same thing does a Republican candidate. So that is a disgrace that we have the money as God.
It is a disgrace, I agree.
So I don't know what you think can be done. I mean, you already said that it is almost impossible to have a constitutional amendment that will reverse all that.
Yeah, there may be some other constitutional ways around this, like public financing of elections. If elections were completely publicly financed, that could be found to be constitutional, and we could get rid of this huge corporate money in the elections. But we're a long way from that. But public financing of elections is one thing that could be pursued. I've talked to Congresswoman Anna Eshoo about this. She supports public financing. She said, what I need is to hear from my constituents that they support it. It's not really on the radar yet. But I'll tell you that my one hope that's going to come out of this terribly distorted election with so much corporate money in it already is that it's going to be so disgusting that it's going to turn everybody off, and people are going to be crying for some kind of reform come the middle of November when it's finally all over. We need a lot of reform in our electoral process in this country, one of which would mean that when one presidential election campaign ends on election day, the next one is starting up already. This is nuts. Other countries restrict the amount of time and the amount of money, but we have this constitutional hurdle thanks to the Roberts Court. So it's going to be a lot more difficult. But this is one of the things that Occupy, as we focus on corporate power, has been focusing on corporate money in our elections, and we just need to keep hammering on that. And along with so many other things, you always hear this accusation, well, what's your program, Occupy? What's your agenda? Don't get caught in that trap. We don't need the agenda. All we have to do is tell our elected leaders, this is broken, it doesn't work, figure out how to fix it, we'll support you. Yeah, you found it.
Great talk,
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed, appreciate it. You mentioned Anna Eshoo.
You know what, since people are behind you, kind of stand up and speak sideways so everybody can hear your
You
question.
mentioned Anna Eshoo. This morning, Anna Eshoo sent an email with a laundry list of priorities to pick from, and it included campaign finance reform. So she must have heard you.
She's on the Peace Center's email list. She knew I was speaking here tonight, and it always scares the heck out of her.
So, if there
I
were
saw that email as well, and I think people should respond to it. It's pretty interesting. And if you're not on Anna Eshu's email list, get on it. Go to her website, eshu.house.gov, and get on her email list and harass her. That's what she's there for. Back there.
I hear a lot about inflation, but I was listening to a talk by Webster Parkley, and he had mentioned that deflation would be worse, but I don't hear anything about like deflationary crash. Is that likely, and how would that play itself out?
Well, I am not an economist, and I hope never to be an economist.
Question?
But most of my economic knowledge comes from following people like Paul Krugman and Ezra Klein at the New York Times and Washington Post, especially their personal blogs, their own blogs there. And this idea of inflation and a lot of economic policy being driven by the fear of inflation, Paul Krugman in particular is very critical of. And in fact, he makes the point that a small bit of inflation is actually beneficial to folks like you and me. The threat of deflation, I'm not up on it enough to answer your question. I have to be honest. The son of a good friend of mine is finishing up his PhD in economics. I'll take him out to dinner when he finishes and see if I can come up to speed.
Couple more questions?
Okay.
I had a question. You brought it up earlier. I really appreciate the background that you gave us on all the information tonight, up through the 70s and stuff, because I really like the background. Has Occupy looked at any of their tactics as far as delivering your message in a more effective and, outside of your numbers?
I think one of the interesting things is that the mainstream media has picked up on Occupy coverage so much. Now, part of that had to do with, let's face it, the visual photo op effect of an actual occupation. But again, as I said in my talk, I think one of the great success stories so far of the Occupy movement in all its varieties is that it has made economic and by extension political inequality a topic of conversation on the national scene. You can see the Democrats, you can see President Obama turning to these themes in their speeches. And that's really powerful, and that also means that the mainstream media is going to continue covering Occupy-related events. That's an awkward way to put it. I don't know how else to put it. So, there's all kinds of different media strategies. I can't stand here and give you a media strategy because it goes with whatever particular action you're doing. I think we had one representative of local media here, the Los Altos Town Crier, and I think that's because I'm a Los Altos resident. But where's the Mountain View Voice? Were they here tonight? What's your media strategy, Mike? The point is, it's a good question. We rely on the media to help broadcast our own message. And we have to keep in mind what our media strategies are and how to try to get them out. Part of that is to just be thoughtful and intelligent and communicate with them and encourage them to get out. One thing to keep in mind, my good friend Norman Solomon, media critic who's now running for Congress up in Marin County, likes to remind progressive activists that freedom of speech is not the same as the freedom to be heard. We have to make sure that we're working on being heard as well as speaking out. And it's something to keep in mind. There's no overall answer to that question, but some of the actions that we do should be geared for the photo op for media. Should we take one more, or what do you want to do, Mike?
Gentleman in the back, and then you'll be around for a little bit, right, Paul?
Sure, I'll hang out.
And maybe before we take one more, before everybody gets up and leaves, this room cost money, so if everybody puts $1 in the basket, if you took one, if you brought one with you, $5 would be good.
How much money do you want, Mike?
Fine, keep the questions going.
Well, I will draw out this answer until the basket has made it all the way around. Yes, sir. What is your...
There's a new book by Glenn Greenwald, just finished it, and it ties in with what we're talking about as another contributing reason for inequality, and that is the law is no longer what it used to be. The law used to replace the king. We left England because we wanted to get away from the king. So the law became the king. That's changed in the last, I think, 40 years he's talking about. The rich, the powerful, in terms of political elite, military elite, governmental elite, the elites are, according to Greenwald, and he makes a pretty strong case for this, immune from law, literally immune.
Yeah.
They don't, you know, it's always been that they could get better lawyers and so forth.
Right.
The rich and powerful. That's nothing new. It's much more than that now. Because now, people let's say what happened on Wall Street, what happened, the illegal wiretapping, there have been case after case that the government or the corporations or whatever, the people that are responsible are not held responsible. They're above that. They're immune. I mean, that sounds absurd, but that's apparently what is happening, and he backs it up.
Yeah.
It's very sad. So these people that could afford to get a lawyer, good lawyer, and get themselves out of whatever trouble, it's unlikely that they will even need one, because very few of them even see the inside of a courtroom. And the Wall Street thing is a case in point. I don't know if you've ever seen the Inside Story.
Inside Job.
Matt Damon. It's a new fly in the ointment that just sort of exacerbates what we're talking about.
Yeah, I haven't read Greenwald's book. What's it called?
It's called
Liberty and Justice for Some.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I certainly will, because I'm a big fan of his. I follow his blog at salon.com. I think the biggest example...
I'm sorry, I just came to my freedom and justice for some.
Yeah. I think one of the starkest examples out there in front of us right now of how the law works differently for different segments of the population, although supposedly we're all the same under the law. Just look at one organization that collects huge amounts of data, releases it to the public, to the newspapers for free, WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange is under indictment, facing prison in any number of countries, apparently including this one. There's news of a secret indictment in this country. You take a look at another organization that collects our personal information, sells it to other corporations for a huge profit, Facebook, of course, and Mark Zuckerberg is a hero. He's not going to jail. He collects our information without our permission, sells it for a huge cost. He's a hero, going to get rich. Julian Assange collects important information, gives it to the newspapers for free, and he's going to jail. This is why inequality, political and economic, is such a danger to our country. It is such a danger to our country. It shows up, it rears its ugly head in so many different ways. And that's why it's got to be confronted. It's going to be a long struggle. If I leave you with anything, I hope it's the inspiration to stay with this. Don't make this a 2012 project. Commit yourselves to it. It's a long-term struggle, and as I've pointed out in history, these long-term struggles do result in successes for progressive, positive achievement in this country. History is on our side. Sometimes it seems bleak, but if we stay at it, we can win. I'll let it go at that. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Paul.